and welcome to The Nation by Bernama TV. I'm Pasha Rahim, and today we are diving deep into a very crucial topic that affects us all, which is food security. Specifically, we'll be taking a closer look at Malaysia's perspective on this pressing issue. Now, joining me in the studio is co-founder and Group CEO of IRGA Girish Ramachandran, who will offer very valuable insights into Malaysia's food security landscape. Welcome to The Nation. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Pasha, and nice to be back at Bernama TV today.
All right. So we often talk about food security in Malaysia, yeah, especially recently. We've got very different perspectives, very different views. From your own observation, from the work that you do in the line of work that you're in, what do you think are some of the primary factors contributing to Malaysia's food security challenges?
Yeah, so food security has been something that has been put in the highlight and the limelight in the last few years post-COVID, because we had a meltdown of the economic system, the supply chains, and in Malaysia we saw a lot of small businesses suddenly becoming very important.
Yeah,
small farms and so on. But when we look at the wider part of food security, I think there are about 6 or 7 issues. The first being land ownership. I think land ownership on a small basis, 2 to 3 acres, on a lease model of 2 to 3 years, always causes problems to farmers who spend money and they plant, and then after that, what happens to the land ownership?
Right.
The second issue, of course, is labor. We've seen a significant shortage of labor in farms because of whether it's the condition or they don't like to work outside in a hot environment. You also have jobs in the service sector, like being a e-hailing driver, that can be very easy to do and monetize, and it gives you cash, and you don't have to worry about working in the hot sun. We are also dependent on foreign labor in this country, which is sort of a double negative, because you have this reliance and the urge to hire somebody locally or do that is just not needed because of the availability of the foreign labor. Supply chain automation, optimization, I think, is something that is very important in Malaysia, and it's a big challenge, trying to get the whole chain, whether it is downstream, midstream, upstream, organized, digitized first, and then digitalized. And of course, the elephant in the room is productivity.
Right.
I think we're about 45% of what high-income developed countries who have agri-food production houses. So we're operating at less than 50% of their productivity levels. Yeah, and it's the same inputs, it's the same terrain. And the final one is essentially around technology, and that's what we do at IRGA on looking at Agritech, hardware, software, biological science.
We'll move into the implementation of tech in agriculture, but right now, what are Malaysia's current food security goals, just to get all of our viewers up to speed on that? And also, how does Malaysia's agricultural policy right now align with those goals?
Sure. So essentially, there are 2 policies. We have the DAN 2, which is the National Agri-Food Policy, which goes up to 2030, which has been, it's a fairly recent policy that's in place. And we have another one called the National Food Security Action Plan, which goes up to 2025. Now the 2 parts to this is essentially looking at domestic sources of production to increase, to substitute imports. And the second is around private sector involvement, and to make sure that there is an involvement in the whole food system, not just certain segments. The other one is on availability of safe food, good quality food, healthy food. Yeah, in Malaysia we're not the healthiest eaters because we like our fast food, or and so on. But the health aspect is very important. The other components are around trying to look at the agri sector impacting the economic sector in Malaysia as a well-being, social well-being of human beings, And of course, looking at preparing the country for food security crisis, which is very important because if we run out of food, everything stops.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something which is of a national priority. So there are 5 sort of key policy thrusts. The modernization and smart agriculture is one. We have to build the talent, to have conducive business ecosystems, robust institutional frameworks, and of course strengthening the entire domestic demand. But what is interesting, and I must applaud the writers of the document, is they also want to look at it to export.
Right.
So using the strategy not only to meet our demands locally, but also to use it as an export sector in the wider global arena. We're already supplying a lot of food to Singapore, which comes out of Johor.
Yeah.
So we're already doing it. It's just taking it to a different level. And of course, the last part is to make sure that all these policies are sort of embedded into the various ministerial real roles and programs.
Right. Just to go back a little bit on the term food security itself, right? So at the very basis of it, it basically means that all people at all times have physical as well as economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food, like you mentioned, that also meets dietary needs and also food preferences. So that's the definition. Last year, the Agriculture Department Deputy DG of Agriculture mentioned that enhancing food security can be done by promoting a resilient agricultural sector. Now, we want to know what that means exactly and what that is on ground.
Yeah. So the word resilience essentially is what we call future proofing. Yeah, and we need to make sure that whatever we have at national, state, local, district level policies are intertwined and they must talk to each other. Yeah, a lot of times these policies, because they deal with land and water, are state control, state matters.
Right.
So you may have federal policies at the top, but it cannot be cascaded onto state and local.
Yeah.
So this is very important to understand because we're trying to put resilient policies in place so to withstand shocks or disease, or even looking at making sure food quality certification, all that has to be put into a single system. At the moment, a lot of these are in silos and they're operated at different levels. So getting everyone to come together, I think it's important. And the good news is all the state governments are fully behind the food security agenda. And if you look at even the parliamentary constituents, the opposition, and everyone agrees that this is an important subject and we work together. So a couple of things here around what needs to be done to make it resilient. The education and training, it's very important we tend to think these are very manual work, but with technology we need to make sure that farmers have the right access to technology and are trained. Food waste issues is starting to become a prevalent policy.
Right.
So it's sort of it's sort of preventive mode rather than reactive. Controlling food waste. I still can't understand the amount of food waste that happens in this country. And it's alarming. It's alarming.
Yeah.
I think the statistics are around 35 to 40% of what is produced at the farm gets wasted along the chain and on the table.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is really around handling and so on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I just find it very ironic, that we have a problem of food wastage, but at the same time, there is also the issue or the problem of hardcore poverty, and these are the people who don't have access to food and they go hungry for days on end. So, in your opinion, would food security, if the country is food secure, would that mean that we would completely eliminate hunger in the country?
The access to food, so there's production of food, right? And before that, there's inputs. Yeah. In Malaysia, we import, I think, more than 5 billion ringgit of food inputs.
Yeah.
Things like fertilizer and so on. And then you've got production.
Right.
Yeah? And then you've got the whole logistics, the distribution to manufacturing bases, processing, retail, consumer. Now, along this chain, a lot of things are not efficient, yeah, and with technology, digitalization, automation, we are able to make sure we don't lose the food along the way. The last part is around access to food, which comes to, you know, inflation, price points. You know, certain groups are unable to have sufficient food, quality of food, and quantity of food because of price points.
Right.
And this is where it's important to treat food as not as a commodity, but the governments need to come in and intervene where they need to. Right. You can't disrupt the private sector in supply and demand, yeah, but you can look at certain ways to subsidize, you know, the hardcore poverty, or even poor, you know, the urban poor, which we don't really talk about much. You know, how do we do that? And really, it's about producing more food with the land we have, conserving less water with the land we have, and making sure the whole chain is talking to each other. And we control it through policies, through programs, projects, and incentivize those who need to be incentivized.
Right. So it's really about optimizing, you know, the resources that we have. We're going to talk about rice, but we're going to go for a very, very short break, and we'll be back with Girish right after this.
Kementerian Perumahan dan Kerajaan Tempatan mengetengahkan 10 inisiatif bagi meningkatkan kesejahteraan serta aspek daya huni rakyat. Inisiatif penyediaan rumah mampu milik, penyelenggaraan dan penggantian lift usang di program perumahan rakyat dan perumahan awam, penarafan bandar pintar, My Kiosk Niaga, tandas awam bertaraf bersih, menawan dan wangi. Inisiatif penyelenggaraan rumah ibadat bukan Islam seluruh negara. Balai-balai bomba baharu 2023. Penggunaan helikopter Emergency Air Ambulance Rescue Services (EMARS). Penutupan hotspot sampah haram. Dan peningkatan penyampaian perkhidmatan melalui Ease of Doing Business. Kerajaan Madani komited dalam menambah baik infrastruktur bagi kesejahteraan dan pembangunan negara.
Thank you for staying with us. You're still with me, Pasha, and we're talking to Girish about food security in the country. Now, let's focus on rice. Just very quickly, our national rice consumption is placed at 2.5 million metric tons. And the government is targeting 75% rice self-sufficiency by 2025. This is under the 5-year 11th Malaysia plan, and also 80% self-sufficiency under the National Agro-Food Policy 2021 to 2030. Right now, we are importing more or less 30% of the rice consumption. We are producing 70%, but still that's not enough to meet the national demand. So what does this mean in terms of tonnage to meet domestic demand, and can we meet this demand on our current trajectory? Can we achieve this this goal of having 75%, 80% rice self-sufficiency?
So the bad news is there's no way we can do it.
Bad news.
We can't do this with our own production.
Right.
The good news is, if you look at the word food security, it doesn't mean we need to produce everything ourselves.
Right.
If somebody else can produce the same product, cheaper, faster, better, same quality, then why should we do it internally? Yeah,
but the argument is also then, if you know, Malaysia as a country that produces rice, why is it that we cannot produce enough for our own consumption?
Yeah, because I think we're just bad at it. Yeah. But the reality is we've dropped rice production over the years. I think we've lost about 50,000 hectares, and the annual rate has been declining at 0.7% from 2013 to 2021. The productivity of rice is essentially also been declining, mainly probably because of cost of the raw materials and inputs have gone up.
Right.
So and it is sort of a controlled commodity in terms of price, because you know, everyone eats it and it's needed. So the challenge here is if we can invest more in R&D and technology, yes, we can improve our productivity, but really we need to take a step back and think about it. We've got our neighbor in Thailand who are extremely well versed with production of rice. They use a lot of new technologies. They use a lot of digital technologies. And the way that they have organized the smallholders it's extreme strong discipline. So if they can produce rice cheaper than us, then why would we want to produce it? That's the key question here. So there are certain states in Malaysia who have actually invested overseas in farms.
Right.
And they produce a crop or livestock, and basically they import back because of climate or situation is better or more conducive for that. So I think we should definitely have our look at this and make sure that we can be more productive with technology, with new processes, automation, look at crop health, R&D. R&D is something that is extremely important. We have a lot of people in the academic side, but maybe they're not talking enough to the private sector, to technology players, equipment manufacturers, and really roll out projects on the private sector side.
Okay, my next question, still on the topic of rice. How does Malaysia's reliance on imported rice impact food security, especially in light of the recent warnings from consumer groups? And, if you're saying that the country is going to produce less and less rice, what impact is this going to have on the farmers?
So to me, I think the rice import is about 1 million tons a year, and it's probably growing a little bit as we go. The population of Malaysia, however, is not growing as fast as it was in the last 10, 15 years. There's been a decline in that growth rate. And even households are not expanding the way that we have saw in the last, say, 20 years. So really the question is going to be around who are we importing the rice from?
Yeah.
I think there are more than 12 countries right now, and we basically have a self-sufficiency ratio of about 62 in 2022. So if we go down the route of depending on imported rice, then we have a natural disadvantage to inflation. You cannot control your own import prices and quantity and also quality.
Right.
So to us, we probably need to segment this a bit into baskets of group needs. And if there's a certain group that needs it at a certain price, then let's prescribe a strategy and a supply chain for that. And that could be locally produced, secure, and delivered.
Right. So if we look at other countries in the region, right, some of them use a mix of sustainable domestic production and also equitable trade deals. So this is great, especially within the Southeast Asian region. But why, are some of these consumer groups that we have locally, why are they looking at this problem of being self-sustainable through the lens of domestic production? I mean, obviously, the way to go forward is to have mutual beneficial trade agreements with all of these other countries, neighboring countries within the region, right?
So the challenge is for whichever country that is exporting food, they will always have, if there's a war going on, a global worldwide war, I have to use my food for my own domestic market, right? So that's something that you can never put in an agreement. Right. To say that if there's a war, you still have to supply me. Nobody's going to sign that. So we must understand that it is the most important thing to a human being, the food. So we can't be sort of dependent on someone else. I think that's the core thing behind it. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on to another of Malaysia's largest exports. We're talking palm oil. So, in that regard, how does Malaysian palm oil contribute to global food security, and what are some of its key attributes in this regard?
Sure. So palm oil is the most consumed vegetable oil globally, and it will be essentially something that grows at about 7-8% over the next 30-40 years. The demand is also growing equally. And when you look at the global food industry, you're talking about a US 11 trillion industry growing. And if you look at what we consume, the oil crops, the largest is palm, and that's easily within a 10% bracket of the type of food we consume. Now, imagine if you don't have cooking oil at all.
Right.
Yeah. So how would that change your cooking in the house? Just think about that. Yeah. And then vegetable oil, palm oil. So it's a very important crop for food security, and people don't make that assumption like that. They think it's not even part. We think of rice, we think of maybe fruits or vegetables, right?
So we're always thinking about the raw ingredient, but we're not looking at all of the other components within the food security sort of ecosystem, if you would say.
So it is a large component of the global, 11 trillion US dollar industry. I think it's about 100 over billion US dollars if you look at the whole sector. So what we need to really do is to look at the attributes. High versatility. You can use it in almost anything.
Yeah.
And there are studies that have shown that in an average week, a human being would have had some amount of palm oil in something that they've eaten.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the world.
Something as simple as chocolate, you wouldn't realize it.
Yes.
How vulnerable would you say is Malaysia to food price fluctuations and global market dynamics, or is the fluctuation in currency a bigger concern?
I think, of course, we when we import and we're importing in US dollars and now ringgit is weakening, we have a problem, right?
Yes.
But inflation has actually dropped, over the last 2 years. I think it was 4.7, it's 2.4 now, under control. And we've also seen probably one of the recent threats, which has looked at these wars that are happening in Ukraine, for example, where a lot of the stock of food came out of Ukraine, and that saw food price inflation on palm oil and other oils. So what we really need to sort of do is we need to hedge what we're importing. And I think we import a significant amount of the food that we consume. I think our import bills are about 70 billion ringgit annually, growing. Yeah, and out of that, we have to understand that 60% of food is imported from overseas.
Yeah,
I think it's about 60%. We rank 43. In terms of the Global Food Security Index, and on availability we rank 56. Now that's a little bit shocking, and we need to address it. The other part which is good to know or important to note is climate change.
Yeah.
And when climate change comes in, we see a whole load of risks in the entire value chain.
So obviously we've got countries like Finland and Denmark who are quite up there. They rank very highly when it comes to food security and also self-sufficiency. Looking into Malaysia, does self-sufficiency, because the argument is if we are self-sufficient, therefore we will be food secure. I want to hear your thoughts. Is self-sufficiency, does it equate to being food secure?
I think like I mentioned earlier, it's very important to make sure that we have food at the right price. And if we want to be totally self-sufficiency with our own 100% production, it's impossible to do that, because you can't be having 2,000 food categories and growing everything locally.
Yes.
And certain things don't grow. Certain things won't grow in this country.
In our climate,
and we shouldn't be forcing ourselves to do that, because it's going to be very expensive, and it may not be of the quality that we want. So we got to work around a model where we have looked at our risk matrix and identified those categories of food, and make sure that we have different strategies for each basket of those categories. I think that's the way that we would look at it. And I think there's not enough education in food security. People don't understand what it means.
Right.
And they say, oh, why do we need to import? And that argument needs to be sort of explained in more clearer languages.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we've had you here with us on The Nation today, Girish, is to shed a light on the issues surrounding food security and also self-sufficiency. That's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much, Girish, for being with us. I think we can go on when we talk about the issues of food security. Thanks for watching The Nation today. I'm Pasha Rahim, and I'll see you next time.